On this channel, I usually chart the family trees of famous dynasties from real-life history, but today I'm doing something different. We are going to look at some of the fictional family trees from the HBO series Game of Thrones. And spoiler alert, if you haven't watched up to Season 7, you'll probably want to stop this video now. Okay, let's begin. Before we look at the tree, let's look at some maps. Most of the show takes place on the continent of Westeros. In Westeros, there are 7 kingdoms. These kingdoms used to be independent, each with their own king. But at the start of the show, they are now united under a single king. However, in each kingdom, there is now a noble family called a house that is in charge of that area. We have House Stark in the north, House Tully in the Riverlands, House Arryn in the Vale, House Baratheon in the Stormlands, House Lannister in Westerland, House Tyrell in the Reach, and House Martell in Dorne. The unification of the 7 kingdoms into a single realm happened about 300 years before the show starts. The person who did it was named Aegon, and he was from an 8th house, House Targaryen. And to explain the Targaryens, we have to go back another 300 years and to another continent. Next to Westeros is an even larger continent called Essos. House Targaryen originated there in a city called Valyria, where they learned to raise dragons. But about 600 years before the show starts, it was prophesied that Valyria would be destroyed, which it eventually was. So before that happened, House Targaryen and their dragons moved to Westeros. They settled here on the island of Dragonstone. The Targaryens lived on Dragonstone for several hundred years until the time of Aegon, when they ended up conquering most of Westeros and uniting the 7 kingdoms. At that time, Aegon took all the swords that were surrendered by his enemies and built the Iron Throne. He also built the city of King's Landing as his capital, and it is still the capital when the show begins. So with that background, we are ready to look at the tree. This tree shows the main house from each of the 7 kingdoms, as well as House Targaryen here in the middle. You can see that 8 generations after Aegon I, the Targaryen line is still ruling Westeros. We get King Maekar I, who was the father of Maester Aemon, as well as the next ruler, Aegon V. We then get King Jaehaerys II, and finally Aerys II, usually referred to as the Mad King. Now by the time the show starts, the Mad King is already dead, and this individual here, Robert Baratheon, is now king. Throughout the series, we get more and more information about what happened, and by season 7, we get a flashback showing the Mad King, as well as his firstborn son, Rhaegar. The story goes like this. About 17 years before the show starts, Aerys II was king, and Prince Rhaegar was the heir to the throne. Rhaegar was married to Elia Martell from Dorne. They actually had 2 small children, but Rhaegar was secretly in love with this woman here, Lyanna, of House Stark in the north. She was the sister of Ned Stark. But Lyanna was originally engaged to Robert Baratheon. Remember, this is before Robert was king and before he married Cersei. At this point, an event occurred which set everything else in motion. Rhaegar kidnaps Lyanna, although it is later suspected that she went willingly because the two were actually in love. But no one at the time knew that. So Lyanna's father, Rickard, and her eldest brother, Brandon, are obviously angry, and they go to see the king. But the king has them killed for treason. This makes Eddard, nicknamed Ned, the head of House Stark. He's now super angry, as well as, of course, Robert, who had been engaged to Lyanna. They launch an all-out war against the king, with some of the other houses, called Robert's Rebellion. Initially, House Lannister sided with the king, but at the last moment switched sides and supported Robert. In the end, Robert wins. Robert kills Rhaegar, and Jaime from House Lannister, who had been one of the king's guards, kills the Mad King. That's how he got the nickname Kingslayer. The Mad King's other two children, Cerys, who was a young child at the time, and Daenerys, a tiny baby born while all this was happening, are swept away to the continent of Essos, where they grow up in poverty. Lyanna then dies of unknown causes, and Robert becomes the king and marries Cersei of House Lannister. 17 years pass rather peacefully with Robert as king, and then the show begins. Now, it's important to remember that Robert himself had Targaryen blood, and that's why he was able to claim the throne. His maternal grandmother was a Targaryen and the aunt of the Mad King. When the show begins, Robert now has 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. But we soon find out that Cersei has an incestuous relationship going with her brother Jaime. Ew. And the 3 Baratheon kids are actually his, meaning that they are actually Lannisters and don't have any Targaryen blood. Robert's good friend Ned now has 5 children. He married Catelyn, originally from House Tully, but he also supposedly has a 6th child, a bastard son named Jon Snow. But who Jon's mother is remains unclear. Catelyn's sister Lisa was married to Jon, head of House Arryn, and therefore she lives in the Vale. They have a son named Robin. One of the very first things that happens in the show is that Jon, who had been serving as Hand of the King, dies mysteriously. Lisa blames the Lannisters, and it's indeed likely that Jon was killed because he had discovered the incestuous relationship between Cersei and Jaime. Lisa later marries Littlefinger, and that's why the Stark children call him Uncle. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The most important thing that happens in Season 1 is that Robert, the king, dies in a hunting accident. This sparks what's called the War of the Five Kings. His eldest son, Joffrey, who of course is actually the son of Jaime, is named king and sits on the Iron Throne. He's king number 1. But Robert's 2 younger brothers, Stannis and Renly, also declare themselves to be king. So here's king number 2 and king number 3. Joffrey has Ned killed because Cersei knows that Ned knows that Joffrey is actually Jaime's son. So Robb, son of Ned, declares himself to be king of the North. So he's king number 4. Finally, there's Balon Greyjoy from the Iron Islands. These islands were separate from the 7 kingdoms, and Balon Greyjoy used Robert's death as an opportunity to declare independence. So he's king number 5. Now, I'm not going to go through every event that occurs in the series, because there's simply far too many. I'm only going to concentrate on the ones that relate to the question of who is the rightful king of Westeros. So here are some things that happen next. Renly marries Marjorie of House Tyrell, but he's actually gay and his lover is Marjorie's brother, Loras. Stannis and Renly get ready to fight one another when Renly is killed by a priestess working for Stannis. That leaves 4 kings. His widow Marjorie then becomes engaged to Joffrey. In the north, Robb is having trouble keeping allies. He therefore promises to marry one of this guy's daughters. Walder was from a minor house called House Frey, but Robb falls in love with Talisa and marries her instead. This angers Walder, and in order to placate him, Robb agrees to have his uncle Edmure, now head of House Tully, to fulfill the promise instead. This leads to the Red Wedding, in which these 2 individuals marry. But Walder, working secretly with the Lannisters, murders Robb Talisa, Caitlin, and many others. That leaves 3 kings. But while we're here, let's talk about the other Stark children. Sansa was originally going to marry Joffrey, but after her father was killed, that was called off. She's eventually forced to marry Tyrion, who was the younger brother of Jaime and Cersei, but the marriage is never consummated. Another minor house, known as House Bolton, eventually takes over the north from House Stark, and Sansa is forced to marry the evil leader of that house, Ramsay Bolton. Ramsay also kills her youngest brother, Rickon. Arya, she disappears from the public eye in season 1 and roams Westeros and then eventually Essos, where she trains as an assassin. Brandon ends up in the far north and develops the ability to see the past and the future. Theon, who was the son of Balon Greyjoy, was originally living with the Starks as their ward, but eventually ends up a prisoner of Ramsay Bolton and is known as Reek. In season 1, Jon is sent to the Wall and becomes a member of the Night's Watch. Let's quickly go back to the map. The Wall is a massive fortification built thousands of years ago to defend against the White Walkers, zombie-like creatures that are now considered by most to be mere legends and not actually real. But the White Walkers are indeed very real and getting ready to invade Westeros. Anyway, Jon becomes commander of the Night's Watch. He's even killed at one point, but then comes back to life with the help of Stannis' priestess. We'll be coming back to Jon in a second, but let's first go back to the other side of the chart. King Joffrey is poisoned on his wedding day, and his younger brother Tommen becomes king, marrying the twice-widowed Margaery. Stannis ends up in the north and sacrifices his daughter Shireen in a religious ceremony in the hopes of defeating the Boltons. But Stannis dies and all is in vain. Balon Greyjoy is killed by his brother, and therefore all 5 kings from the War of the 5 Kings are now dead. The new king, Tommen, doesn't last long either. A radical religious sect takes over the capital city, and eventually Cersei blows up their temple, killing Margaery and Loras. Tommen then jumps out of a window and commits suicide. So by the end of season 7, almost everyone on this side of the chart is dead. Only Jaime, Cersei, and Tyrion remain. In fact, with Tommen gone, Cersei, as wife of a king and mother to 2 kings, is now crowned as the ruling monarch. But there's one individual we haven't mentioned yet, Daenerys Targaryen, daughter of the Mad King. Her brother Viserys dies in season 1, leaving her the only remaining heir of King Aerys II. For the rest of the series, we see Daenerys in various locations throughout the continent of Essos, trying to build an army so that she can return to Westeros and claim the throne. She raises 3 dragons and is often referred to as the Dragon Queen. But there's a big reveal at the end of season 1. It turns out that Jon Snow is not the son of Ned Stark after all. He is the son of Ned's sister, Lyanna Stark, and Rhaegar Targaryen. Remember that Lyanna and Rhaegar had run away together 17 years before the show started, and that this is what sparked Robert's rebellion. Well, it turns out that these 2 had a child before they both died, and that this child's real name is Aegon. Before Lyanna died, she entrusted her son to Ned Stark and asked Ned to keep his identity a secret. Ned therefore raised him as a bastard, but really all along he's been the true heir to the throne, having an even better claim than Daenerys. Jon Snow doesn't know this yet. In fact, these 2 meet up and end up having sex. Daenerys would be Jon Snow's aunt, and he would be her nephew. So at the end of season 7, the 5 kings are gone, King Tommen is gone, and we are left with 2 queens instead. Queen Daenerys and Queen Cersei. But just when they are about to go head to head, an even bigger problem arises. The White Walkers break through the wall in the north and start heading south. And this is where Season 7 ends. Season 8 is scheduled for April 2019, and we'll have to wait until then to see what happens. In the meantime, if the struggle for power between noble houses is something you find interesting, I've got 2 wall charts based on the real-life Game of Thrones. There's this European royal family tree, starting with Charlemagne and going all the way down to today. And then there's also the Asian royal family trees, with Genghis Khan in the middle, but including dynasties all the way from the Middle East to Japan. These 2 charts are available on my website, usefulcharts.com, or you can subscribe to the channel and watch the many videos I have explaining each royal family tree in detail. Thanks for watching.